So there's some really smart people who live in our world who think that everything that happens is just a random coincidence. That the way that the world was created and the way the world is structured means that there's really no meaning or purpose to anything. It's all just a cosmic accident. And these are really, really, really smart people who think this way. I happen to disagree with them, but there are times in my life where I can see where they're coming from. Where it just kind of seems like nothing is going the way I think it should. That it doesn't seem like there's any rules to the universe. It doesn't seem like things actually matter. You know, I go through my day, I live my life, and it's the same thing over and over, right? In the school year, you wake up and it just kind of seems like the same routine over and over. And it's hard to see that there might be a God who is in charge of it all, who knows everything that's going on, and who is even at work in the midst of all of it. Have any of you ever felt this way? Like it's just, what is the purpose? So I'm going to talk to Josh today. Joshua, you and me, buddy. All right? You see, I kind of wish that as I read through the Bible, I see all these stories where God shows up and God does amazing things. He splits the sea wide open. He does all these plagues. He is a pillar of fire or a cloud of smoke, or he heals people, or he tears open the heavens, and you're like, I wish that would happen, because it would make this whole following Jesus thing easier. Right? If God were to just like rip open the ceiling of this room and be like, hey guys, I'm real. We'd be like, oh, awesome. Like, this makes it so much easier. All of the doubt, all of the things that I've questioned, I'd be like, maybe I don't understand it, but I know he's real, so I'm going to trust him. Would anybody like for that to happen today? Yes. Right? It would alleviate so many things, so many problems, so many things that I worry about today. And so the impression that I get with the Bible is that God always acts in that way. That is always the way God acts. But he doesn't do that anymore, so is he even real? What's going on? But what I want us to do is, I want us to come across a story where it doesn't go this way. Where that's not how the story plays out. That it kind of turns out to work in a way that we don't necessarily quite expect. You see, today we're going to start a series that we're calling The Work of God. And in this series, we're going to look at the book of Esther. How many of you even knew that there was a book in the Bible called Esther? All right, sweet, right? How many of you have actually read the book of Esther? Okay, sweet. So some of you, but some of you are like, I know there's a book, but I don't really know the story. You see, Esther is this book that actually takes place shortly after the book of Daniel. So we just finished last week our series in the book of Daniel, and we're going to kind of carry on. Even though Esther comes before Daniel in the way that the Bible is ordered, it doesn't mean that it actually happened before it. It actually happens after it. And so the way that the Persians worked, right, if you remember at the end of the story, it starts with Babylon being in charge. It ends with Persia being in charge. And Persia runs things differently than Babylon. Babylon, they wanted to bring people in, they wanted to brainwash them, they wanted to show their power and kind of influence people in that way. Persia did things differently. Persia was more okay with people kind of doing things their way as long as they were respectful of the empire. As long as they were willing to work with the empire, they would let people kind of have their own culture. And so Daniel is kind of between Daniel and Esther, the people get to go back. The book of Ezra and Nehemiah, those stories are people going back to the land and they rebuild the temple and all this stuff. But some people stayed in Persia. And Esther is the story of the people who stayed. It's a glimpse into what life was like for these people who chose to stay in Persia. And there are some things that I think are going to be helpful for us as we begin to look at this book. You see, one is that the book of Esther is really one of the most important books to the Jewish people. They say that there's going to be 6 books that they read for all of eternity. The first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, and then the book of Esther. You're like, well, that's weird. Why? Like, why is Esther so important? To them, it is so important because it shows God working in a very unique way. There's a festival that comes up. It finds its origins in the book of Esther. It's called Purim. And they still celebrate this today. And they still find it a huge deal. It's a huge part of their history as God shows up in a unique way. But there are two things that we need to understand. This book is kind of challenging at times because it's telling a story, but God is not mentioned one time. It's a story about how God works in people, but God is not mentioned in the book of Esther ever, which is weird to me, right? Like, oh, this is the Bible. It's about God. But God's not mentioned in the book of Esther, not even one time. So you have to kind of do some digging. You have to read between the lines to see where and how God is working. But here's why I think this is actually really helpful for us. Because we know that our life looks like that a lot. Where there's not a narrator who steps in and says, and then God talked to the person, and this is what God was doing behind the scenes. Right? It's just, we're living life, and it's happening, and we're just trying to figure it out. And this book shows us that it's not always simple, like really straightforward. That a lot of the times you have to dig. You have to look for what God is doing and what God is up to. The second thing that I think is going to be troublesome, and we may not pick up on this, but I want to bring it to our attention a lot as we go through this book, is that two of the main people in this story, their names are Esther and Mordecai. And they're Jewish people, and you could probably call them like the heroes of the story, but they're messed up people. Like, they are not examples of these really upstanding people who were always trusting God. Really, they're these messed up people who are just kind of trying to survive. And in order to do that in this culture, they're making some choices and decisions that are not necessarily obedient to God. So, as we go through this book, I don't want us to get through these stories and be like, oh, I'm supposed to be like Esther, or I'm supposed to be like Mordecai, because there's some moral ambiguity in this story. This is really about God and what God does through people, even when they make bad decisions, even when they don't necessarily do things the way that they're supposed to. So that's going to be some things that are going to be some of the most important, but some of the most challenging things as we go through this book. Today we're just going to look at the first kind of opening scenes. We're just going to get the framework for what's going on. But I want us to treat this like a story. We're going to look at the takeaways, but we're going to treat it like a story. So I'm not going to tell you where I'm reading. I'm going to read straight from the Bible. But I want you to just listen. This is story time. Not bedtime story, but story time. So don't fall asleep. But listen to the story. Listen to what's happening. And then we'll talk about why I think this is important and what we need to do with this. Okay? So if you want to try and follow on, it's in Esther chapter 1. Spoiler alert. Yes, we're talking about the book of Esther. So verse 1. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes. The Xerxes who ruled over the 127 provinces stretching from India to Cush. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. And in the third year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. The military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes and the nobles of the provinces were present. For a full 180 days, he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. When these days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days in the enclosed garden of the king's palace for all the people from the least to the greatest who were in the citadel of Susa. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. On the seventh day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, aka drunk, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him. Sweet names coming up. Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown, in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Then the king became furious and burned with anger. According to the law, what must be done to Queen Vashti, he asked. She has not obeyed the command of King Xerxes that the eunuchs have taken to her. Then Memucan replied in the presence of the king and the nobles, Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and the peoples of all the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day, the Persian and Median women of nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end of disrespect and discord. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Also, let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. Then, when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all this vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands, from the least to the greatest. The king and his nobles were pleased with this advice, so the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent dispatches to all parts of the kingdom, to each province in its own script, and to each people in their own language, proclaiming that every man should be ruler over his own household. Later, when King Xerxes' fury had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed about her. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful young women into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Hege, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let the beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiachin, king of Judah. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother had died. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Hege. Esther was also taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Hege, who had charge of the harem. She pleased him and won his favor. Immediately, he provided her with beauty treatments and special food. He assigned her to 7 female attendants selected from the king's palace and moved her and her attendants into the best place in the harem. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. When the virgins were assembled a second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. But Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to do. For she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions as she had done when he was bringing her up. During the time of Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the 2 officials were impaled on poles. All this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. So, let's get some context for what's going on here, okay? Because that was a lot. So, this guy, Xerxes, is in charge of everything. He's in charge of 120 provinces from India all the way to Kush, which I'm sure you all know where Kush is. It's okay if you don't. But he owns, basically, dude owns a lot of land. He's in charge of a lot. And what he wants to do is he wants to go to war. And so he has to get all 127 of his provinces on board with this plan in order for it to actually work. So the way that he's going to do this, the way he's going to convince them, is that he's going to throw a 6-month party that shows how much power he has, how much wealth he has, and why this is a great idea. Right? A 6-month party. That's a long time. Okay? So at the end of this, you need to understand how decisions get made at this point. They thought that getting drunk brought you closer to the gods. So in order to have more wisdom, they would get drunk. Seems backwards, but this is the way they thought. But they wouldn't just make decisions when they were drunk. They would make a decision while they were drunk, but they wouldn't let that be the final decision. They would wait 24 hours until they had sobered up, and then they would be like, was that a good idea? Did we come up with a good idea, or was it a really bad idea? Right? So they would decide whether or not that was actually a good idea, and then they would enact it. So this is what's happening. They're making decisions while getting wasted for about 6 months. Their livers had to be shot by the end of this. But at the very end of it, just kind of the final kicker of Xerxes trying to show his power and his wealth and how good he has it, he says, you know what, I'm going to bring out my wife. She's a hottie. I'm going to bring her out, and I want them to just see how beautiful she is. And she says, no. Which is a big deal in this culture. This isn't like, there's not a whole lot of equal rights for women at this point. They are expected to do what the men say. And she says no. And Xerxes doesn't really know what to do. So he gets his buddies together. He's like, what do I do? My wife has disrespected me. And so they get drunk and they're like, let's do this. Let's not make her queen anymore. And then let's find someone better. And then let's make a law that tells all the women, respect your husbands. Otherwise, there's going to be no, I love the way it says it, there will be no end to the disrespect. They will just continually disrespect because Vashti has set a terrible example for them. And they're like, that sounds like a great idea. A bunch of dudes are like, yeah, this sounds like a good idea. This sounds like a great idea to tell the women, obey us. Now, the Bible is going to talk about respect and wives respecting their husband. But we need to understand, this is not one of those situations. When the guy is like, hey, come put on a show for us. Let me treat you like an object. It's probably okay for the woman to say, no thanks, I don't appreciate that. And this is what happens. So this isn't like, we need to understand that. Respecting each other as spouses is important. That's important. The Bible will affirm that later. This is not one of those situations. Okay? And so, we have this scenario where Xerxes appears to be the most powerful man in the kingdom. But what we really find out is he's basically a drunk fool. He doesn't understand what's going on. He doesn't really have power in the way that we think about it. Then the scene shifts to Esther. Esther has no power. If you understand culture that's going on, she's not Persian, she's Jewish, and she has no family. So there's nothing connecting her to any sort of power whatsoever. She is as low as you can get on the totem pole. You see, God is trying to show that He doesn't always work in the typical power structures that we think. God is showing that, hey, I can use someone who has no influence to actually have tremendous amounts of courage and power. And I can take people who appear to have all the power, and I can make them look like fools. God works with a different economy. And so there's three things that I want us to take away from this, because I think it's important for us to see what's going on here. The first one is this. Just because God is silent doesn't mean that He is absent. Right? We read through a bunch of this story. God's not mentioned in anywhere, but there are certain things that are occurring that show that God is up to something. that he is going to use the circumstances that are facing Esther and Mordecai, and he's going to use them for his own purposes. It just gains favor with Xerxes. It just so happens that Mordecai is in the right place at the right time to hear about this assassination plot. Throughout this book, it's just going to seem like there is a lot of really neat coincidences that just so happen to work in the favor of Esther and Mordecai. And the author wants us to see God is at work in those things. That even though he's not mentioned, he is still at work. You see, this story, I find a lot of things that I can relate to in it. Because, a year and a half ago, I was in a job that I didn't love, but I felt like God had me there for a season, and I was becoming more and more discontent with that job. And I finally got to a place where I was like, I need to step out. This isn't a good fit for me anymore. It's not a good fit for them. There's someone who could do this job better. I need to step out. I had started grad school, and so I was like, I'm just going to work at like a grocery store. I'm just going to make money while I finish grad school. I need something that is not very intensive, that can just get me through grad school. And that was my plan. But as I was looking for jobs, I just kept coming back to like, I feel like I want to work at church. I feel like I can't get the way my mind works, the way my heart works, I need to do a job that has meaning and has purpose. I don't know that I can just like put boxes on shelves. Like that's just not the way I work. And so I kept looking at church jobs against all my initial intentions. I applied for a job at a church in Gulf, had an interview with them, a Skype interview, and it went really well. They didn't ever respond back after that. Like, just no contact. It was not even a, hey, we're giving the job to someone else. It was just silence. So I was like, I guess I didn't get that job. I'm guessing I'm not going to hear from them. Still haven't heard from them. I don't know what happened. They're going to call me tomorrow. Hey, remember that job? Anyways. So I don't get that job. I'm like, okay. I'm still not sure. Because I have conditions to this. Like, I want to stay local. My wife's family's here. We don't want to uproot and take a job at a church somewhere random. So there's kind of some conditions to this. And that's not usually how church jobs work. You kind of are willing to go places, right? Derek ends up in California from Chicago. That's the kind of thing that normally happens. I have a bunch of students who go to Creekside, and they had a similar situation to us. Their youth pastor was moving into adult ministries, so they had an opening in their junior high position. I was like, I don't know that I love junior hires. I've never worked with them really, but I do love junior hires. I have not worked with them. So I don't know if I'm going to be good at this job, but I'm going to apply anyways. So I apply for the job, get through a round of interviews, get called back for like an in-person interview. I meet with some of their leaders and the guy who was moving out of that position, and I get an email the next day that basically says, you know what, I don't think this is going to be a good fit for you. And he talked about some other things, but I was like, I'm just not going to get this job. And so I was like, that's kind of the end of that. And so I'm kind of still trying to figure out, what am I going to do with my life? What's going to happen? I'm not really sure how this is all going to play out. I get a call, an email, it was a text from my wife one day. I was at work, it was the last week of school. I'm sitting in my office, kind of just getting some things wrapped up. I knew I wasn't going back to that job. Still didn't know what I was going to be doing. But my wife texts me and she says, hey, you need to send your resume and your, like, anything you have over to the pastor at LifePointe. I was like, okay, why? She's like, okay, so turns out, my son is homeschooled. We work with a charter school. His teacher for the last couple of years happened to be Pastor Chris's wife. She randomly is in our house. She went to the same college. We have these connections, things like that. And this is all happening like 2 years ago. End of last year, my wife and them were, for whatever reason, talking about me and my job transition, and it just so happens that my sister-in-law is there with them because she was also teaching her kids as well. And jokingly, my sister-in-law says to her, hey, are you guys looking for a youth pastor? Ha ha ha. And she responds, actually we are. You should have him send all of his stuff over to my husband. And so we I did that, obviously. I did that. And about a month and a half later, I get offered the position here. I'm talking to Derek a couple months into it, and we're just kind of talking about how crazy it all was. And I find out that in the email that the guy from Creekside had sent me, he said, hey, I have some, come on. I have a buddy, I have some friends who are looking to fill some positions, and would you be okay if I send them your information? I said, yeah, that's fine, but I have no idea. I don't know where these people are. He didn't say what church. He didn't say where. I'm thinking it could be a random person in Oregon or like something like, I don't know anything about anything. And he never follows up with it. He never says, cool, I'll send that stuff over. I'm talking to Derek, and I find out that Phil had sent my stuff to Derek and said, hey, I think he'd be a great fit at your church. And so Chris comes to Derek and says, hey, I just got this stuff from this guy. And Derek says, oh, that's interesting. I got that same stuff from Phil. And I look it back and I go, oh, this is one of those scenarios where God was working and I didn't necessarily hear him go, here's what's going to happen. Trust me. Like, I didn't have that. It was a total, I'm just kind of going through life. I'm making decisions. And God is working and weaving all of these things together, and it is not a coincidence at all. And so God was never like audible, like this is what you should do. But I just was like, I'm going to do life. I'm going to do the things that are coming up. I'm going to go through, make decisions, and God was at work in all of it. And that's the story for most of you. Very few people are going to feel like a very distinct and clear voice telling them what to do. That doesn't mean God doesn't like lead you and give you like strong feeling. Like God works and God acts, but it's not always obvious. And sometimes it just feels like your gut reaction. You're not sure if you're supposed to or not. That's the way it is for most of us most of the time. And this story shows that that is okay. That God is, this fly is driving me nuts. That God is still at work. God is still doing things. And so we need to be looking for the ways, this is like this light, looking for the ways that God is at work, even when it seems like he's silent. Because he is still at work. He is not absent. The second thing is this. Appearances can be deceitful. Appearances can be deceitful. See, we look for people who have power. We look for people who look the part. We're drawn to them. We want to give them influence. But we quickly learn over and over again in the Bible and in this story that appearances can be deceitful. Xerxes is a fool. He doesn't really know what he's doing. But people are willing to give him influence and give him stake in what's happening. Esther's a nobody. But she has something more to her. Something that God can use, substance that God is willing to work with. So as we look for people in our lives to have influence in our lives and to give some influence in who we listen to, we need to make sure that they have substance. Not that they just look the part, not that they have enough influence in other places that they'll help us get far, but there's substance to them. So that they'll take us to places that will actually matter. And that will actually put us in positions for God to have influence and work in our lives. The third thing is this. We need to ask this question. It's going to sound similar to what we talked about in our series on Daniel. We need to ask ourselves, are we giving up our identity in order to fit in with our culture? Now, Esther is kind of a mess when we first start this story. Okay? She is basically she's selling herself out in order to gain influence with the king. She becomes a concubine. She's willing to become an object used for pleasure in hopes that it will get her into a place of influence. This isn't a great decision. Okay? The moral of the story is not, hey, go sell yourself. That might work out for you. Okay? It's the opposite of that. Like, this is one of those places where we're not looking at Esther and going, good choice, Esther. No, this is a place where God's like, oh boy, okay, well, I'll use this, but this is not the ideal situation. She compromises who she is. Right? It says over a couple times, she doesn't reveal who she is, or what nationality she is. She's afraid that will cause her to lose influence. And this comes at the instruction of Mordecai. Again, not a great choice. You see, if you contrast this with Daniel, Daniel was like, no, this is who I am. I follow this God, and I'm not going to compromise. I will draw a line in the sand before I make a decision that will compromise my relationship with God. Esther doesn't do that. But what we're going to see is that God uses bad decisions. So, again, just to be clear, the moral of this story is not, oh, it's okay to make bad decisions because God will use them. Okay? The moral of the story is, if you have made bad decisions in the past, God will use those things. God does not make those who you are. He writes a different story based off of the things and the mistakes. And every leader here could tell you examples of that. Places where we have screwed up, where we have not been wise, and somehow God has managed to use that for His purposes. And that's what we see in this story. You see, your story is not done. Your story is still being written because God's story is still being written. God wants to use you. And He's not necessarily going to tell you how He wants to use you. He's often going to lead you into places. And you're going to feel woefully inept. Like, there's no way I can do this job. There's no way I can have influence. But God will lead you into places where He can and will use you. Because He is writing a story. Esther starts off a mess, but by the end of this book, she is going to be a courageous leader. And it's not by her own doing, it is all through what God is doing. And so, as always, we come to this place of, are we going to trust? Are we going to trust that God is actually doing something, even when it doesn't feel like He is? Are we going to trust that God is writing a story that is better than the one that we could write on our own? I'm hoping that through this series in Esther, we'll see that God is a masterful storyteller, even when He's not doing so in a super obvious way. Let's pray. Jesus, I thank You for the fact that you're doing something, that You are at work. And each student that's in this room, you are working in unique ways, that no two stories are the same. That maybe the only consistent thing that's in each story is the fact that you're the one writing it. And so there's value in listening to each other, and there's value in seeing the unique ways that you work, because sometimes it might seem like you're silent in our life, but you are working in someone else's life in a way that we can see and we can hear. So Jesus, I ask that today You'd help us to trust that just because things might be silent doesn't mean that you're absent. You are still walking through this with us. You're still writing a story for us. I pray You help us to not compromise in order to fit in with a culture, to not make decisions that will make Your story harder to tell, but that we would just trust. And that we would trust that Your story is better than the one that we could write on our own, or the one that even our culture could write for us. But we love You, and we thank You for the fact that You love us enough to stick with us in the midst of the mess, in the midst of what seems to be just the chaos of our lives. You're still constant through it all. We love You, and we pray all these things in Jesus' name.